Good evening, my holy sisters and brothers. Wasn't that fun? That was a live performance at a private party by the Moshav band singing Shlomo Carlebach's song, Higher and Higher. It's the best thing to get high on is a relationship with the Lord. How are you? It's great to be with you. It's a Monday night, and we've got some beautiful, beautiful teachings as we finish up chapter 4 and enter chapter 5 here in Tractate Shekalim, the 5th volume of the Talmud. We are doing Daf Yud Gimel, page 13 in Tractate Shekalim. Let's light up the darkness. Who's with us as we get it going on a Monday night? NCAA March Madness in April, championship Monday night. Yehudit in Florence, South Carolina, James in Indianapolis, Stephen in New Hampshire, who I think recently had a birthday. Happy birthday, Stephen. Paula in Chicago, Renee in Indy, Ann in Merced, Yosef in Massachusetts, Gail in Virginia, Melissa in Great Neck, Nancy in North Carolina, Michael in Scranton, Bill, happy to be back with us live from Berkeley, Miriam in Colorado, Rochelle in Modesto, Harold in Oregon, Tom in PA, Pauline in Arkansas, Chaim in Charlotte, Howard in Shalom from O. What's O? Is that Oregon? And Mr. Chand from Faisalabad in the Punjab, Pakistan. Welcome. It's so great to have you all here. Over there on the YouTube side, Gwen wishing us a good evening. Gigi in British Columbia and Lynn in North Texas. Welcome, everybody. Let me just turn that off so it's over here. Okay, so we're going to keep looking every day, every time we study together. We're looking for those takeaways, right? Today, not going to be so difficult. This is one of those days where there's some beautiful, those more kind of lyrical teachings. Sometimes it's lore, stories, agadata. Sometimes more ethical teachings, where it's kind of easier to extract that takeaway than on some other days when we're, a little bit more in the weeds on the minutiae, as it were. So let's just get right into it. Chapter 4. So this whole tractate, Shekalim, is about the finances of the temple when it stood. The shekalim, the shekels themselves, were the yearly half shekel, silver half shekel, that was obligated for every adult Jewish male to pay into the temple treasury to fund the daily offerings that were brought on behalf of the whole Jewish people, morning and afternoon every day, additional offerings for Shabbos and festivals. In addition, especially as we'll see today when we're entering chapter 5, the temple was responsible for a lot of other things in Jerusalem. I mean, still for the religious life of the people, as it were, responsible for the souls of the people. But they had a lot of work to do. There was a lot going on in that temple. It was a real destination, people coming and going all the time. It was a big enterprise. There was a lot of stuff to do there. And while there were at times, tragically, corrupt practices that entered the temple, the vast majority of everything that the temple did and stood for was a thing of great beauty. It really was that place where sort of heaven and earth kissed. There was this idea where people would come and bring their offerings. And especially in the first temple period, there were continuous miracles that were available, that were visual. You could see it, right? This was a supernatural place, as it were. Supernatural, not like meaning, magical mumbo jumbo, but, beyond the natural. There was a somewhat of the miraculous was always going on there. And it was a place where you could feel its inherent spirituality as soon as you entered the grounds. And so many of the practices and laws associated with the running of the temple, they came from the Torah, and they had in mind that it was not run as a business. The temple had to do business in order to supply the pilgrims with what they needed in order to bring their offerings. But it was not a business establishment. It was a place very much about the soul of the individuals who came and the soul of the nation, as we'll see. Okay, so we're finishing chapter 4 with the fifth Mishna of chapter 4, and this is like the shortest Gemara I think I've ever seen. The Mishnah is 3 times as long as the Gemara on this Mishnah number 5 at the end of chapter 4, and it's a very short Mishnah. So we'll just do that quickly. So chapter 4 was all about what to do basically with excess money, excess collection, offerings, animals that had been set aside to be offered, and then for one reason or another they couldn't be offered, or people who had consecrated their property or consecrated an animal to be offered in the temple, and then it couldn't be offered, and what do we do with those situations? That's what chapter 4 was all about. And so this final Mishnah here in chapter 4, once every 30 days, the prices, and we've encountered this concept already, once every 30 days, the prices at which the temple supplies, such as wine, flour, or oil, which were necessary to accompany other offerings, will be purchased. The prices at which the temple supplies, like wine, flour, or oil, would be purchased. Those prices are set for the temple chamber, meaning the prices are set for what the treasury will pay the merchants who bring those products that are needed for the temple. And this set price is implemented in the following way. Any merchant who undertakes to provide fine flour. So fine flour, it was bread, right? It was basically matzah, but it was the soft matzah of the temple period, not the stiff, crumbly matzah of today. But it was always unleavened bread that would accompany offerings when there was a bread component to an offering. And there were the showbreads that were baked and put on the table of the showbreads, and they were there all week and then replaced on Shabbos. And so all of those required fine flour. So the merchant who undertakes to provide fine flour to the temple, after the chamber, meaning the treasury of the temple, set a price of, for example, 4 sa per sella, right? So a volume, a sa that we've talked about before. And so if the flour was going to cost, 4 sa, right? So 4 of these, we could think of them today as, cubic cubits, or that's not an exact measurement at all, but just think of it as bundles of flour, bags of flour, and they were going to, let's say the temple set the price, that is the market price, that at the day that the temple set the price. And so the market price on that day is 4 of these bags of flour per sella, right? So that was a valuable coin, a sella. However, so that then they set the price for the upcoming month. And any merchant who undertakes to provide fine flour for the chamber is going to pay is going to sell them at 4 bags per sella. So even if the general market price rose and it became 3 bags of fine flour for this sella coin, the merchant must still provide fine flour based on the set price at the beginning of the month, which was 4 bags of flour for this coin. However, if the chamber set the price at the market price at the beginning of the month, and it was 3 bags per sella, and then the general market price rose, the general market price fell to where it was 4 bags of flour per sella, so he must now provide the fine flour based on the new market price of 4 bags per sella. And this is in order that the temple treasury of consecrated property always has the upper hand. And that's what we have to keep understanding, that the temple always wins, because the temple is not a for-profit business, and it is not only a non-profit business, but it is an absolutely holy undertaking. And because there are laws in the Torah that you can never appropriate consecrated property to yourself. You can't make use of consecrated property for yourself in any way, right? Even if, for example, a cow belonged to the temple, it was going to be brought as some kind of offering at some point, and while it was being held at the temple, it was producing milk, for example. So the milk that came from that cow, it could only be used for holy purposes. Maybe it could be used to feed the priests in the temple, but you couldn't milk that cow, take that milk and take it home, because then you would have appropriated, consecrated property for yourself, and you can't do that. And so in every way, nothing that is consecrated can end up even a little bit inuring to the benefit of an individual, right? Or of even a group or a company or a corporation. Anything that's not the temple can't. And so that's why when business is done with the temple, if market conditions change where you would end up making like a profit at the expense of the temple, you would then have actually made this transgression of using consecrated property for yourself. And that's why they arranged things so that the temple would always have the upper hand. If, for example, fine flour became wormy, it became wormy for the merchant. In other words, he bears the loss if the ruined fine flour, if the fine flour that he sold to the temple then became wormy before it was turned into the cakes, the unleavened cakes that would be offered along with an offering, he'd have to replace them. Similarly, if he sold wine to the temple and before the wine was used in sacramental purposes, consecrated purposes, to accompany offerings, it turned to vinegar, then the merchant who sold the wine to the temple would have to replace that wine from his own stock. This is because the merchant only receives, i.e., he earns his money once the altar is satisfied. In other words, the transaction is only realized once the items have been offered on the altar. That's the Mishnah, and here's the very short Gemara. It was taught in a Baraisa in the name of Rabbi Shimon. The merchants would immediately receive their money, right? So they're not supposed to be paid until what they sell to the temple is used. But in fact, in point of fact, the temple didn't take advantage of them that much. They would pay the merchants immediately because there was no concern that the meal, the flour would become wormy or that the wine would turn to vinegar, because the priests were so diligent. As soon as something was sold to them, they would take care of it and they would use it promptly. So they didn't have this concern that what was sold to them would be inferior or that it would end up, going bad before it was used. That concludes chapter 4 here in Tractate Shekalim. Now we enter chapter 5, and this is a fascinating chapter. Now we're going to be talking more specifically about the roles of people who worked in the temple. Not only the priests who were receiving and bringing offerings to the altar, but there were other officials that worked in the temple as well. And so as we study them and some of the standouts whose names were recorded here in the Talmud, we also get more of a feeling of what life was like at the temple. Recall that the priests served in shifts. There would be like a whole new shift each week, and they would serve for a week. And then they would be replaced by another whole shift of priests. And there were 26 of these shifts. So basically, each priest would serve for a week at a time, twice a year. But in addition to the priests, there were other officials, and we're going to be learning about them now. Here in this chapter 5, and also some of the other responsibilities that officials of the temple undertook, both within the temple and within that sort of greater compound that had also a measure of holiness known as Jerusalem. Okay, so halacha number 1 here in chapter 5 of Tractate Shekalim. These are the officials who served in specific positions in the temple. Now, this is very interesting. We're going to get a list of names here of people who had specific jobs in the temple. Now, the first temple was there for 400 years. It was destroyed. There was a 70-year exile, the Babylonian exile, before they came back and rebuilt the second temple and then started it up again. And some of the miracles, the sort of ongoing daily miracles that were there in the first temple, were not part of the second temple. And the magnificence of Solomon's temple was not there. It was a humbler temple, the second temple. But there were priests working there, and they took offerings, etc. And that temple stood for another 400 plus years. So in the 800 years that the temples were standing, obviously there were many, many, many more individuals who had these jobs, which I'm about to enumerate for you, than the one person who's named here. And so the question is asked, why are these people named for these specific jobs? The first one, for example, is Yochanan ben Pinchas, who was responsible for the seals. So the seals, meaning like when you seal a letter or when you seal something, it was almost like in other words, like a pilgrim would come and want to give an offering, and maybe he brought his lamb all the way, from his home, and he walked, for 3 or 4 or 5 days to get to Jerusalem to bring his offering. But maybe he didn't also bring the additional items that were necessary for his offering, depending on what kind of a sacrifice it was. Maybe he needs wine, maybe he needs this fine flour, maybe he needs oil, maybe he needs certain spices. These other items, he could buy them either in Jerusalem in a certain market, or he could buy it in the temple itself. Probably it cost a little bit more to buy it from the temple, but then he could be absolutely assured that it was going to be valid, that there were no problems with it, that it was sort of certified by the priests themselves. And so the way that it would work is he would go to one station in the temple and pay his money into the temple treasury, and they would give him a sort of a seal, not really a paper with a seal on it, but it's a kind of a token that he would then take to another part of the temple and get his wine libation or his container of fine flour or the frankincense or whatever it was that he needed. So the one who was in charge of this kind of disbursement system within the temple was Yochanan ben Pinchas. So now, was Yochanan ben Pinchas the one who in charge of the seals for 800 years? No, obviously not. So why is he named as the one example of the person who had this job during all those generations? One opinion is because he was the most outstanding who ever did it. He was like the most righteous and the most dedicated and the best example of all the people who had that job. Another opinion is that he was the first person to have this job. When the job was created, as it were, he was the first one to hold the office. And it might even be possible that then whoever was his successor would actually be called by the name of the first person who had that office. Or there's another opinion that the Tana, the rabbi of the Mishnah who's describing these jobs, and probably this is a rabbi who lived during the Second Temple period before it was destroyed. And what he was taught, the people that he names are the ones who had those jobs when he happened to go to the temple and visit them. And these are people who he knew personally who had these jobs. We're not sure which is the correct interpretation, but now we're going to name these specific individuals who had these jobs. So Achia was responsible for the libations. In other words, the wine, the oil, and the flour prepared with the level of ritual purity necessary for the libation offerings and the meal offerings, which accompanied many animal offerings. And Achia supplied the libations to those who presented the appropriate seal, right? Who was in charge of the seals? Yochanan ben Pinchas. Then another official was Matya ben Shmuel, who was responsible for the lotteries, which were used to select priests for the various temple services each day. Petahya was responsible for the pairs of birds. In other words, for certain kinds of offerings, there was a pair of birds that were brought. The turtle doves or pigeons that were brought by a zav or a zava. This is a person who was ritually impure because of certain bodily emissions. Also a woman after childbirth, and one suffering from tzara'as, that disease which is a physical manifestation of a spiritual malady. And they placed the appropriate sum of money into the horn designated for this purpose. And each day Petahya oversaw the purchase of birds from that money and their sacrifice in the proper manner. Incidentally, the Gemara mentions this man, Petahya, is Mordechai. Now, that would indicate that it's not, that he wasn't known personally to this rabbi who happened to be writing about it in the late Second Temple period during the Mishnaic period. Because if Petahya is Mordechai, this is the Mordechai who was Esther's protector in the Book of Esther, right? And so the story of Esther takes place between the two temples. It takes place over there in Persia, where Ahasuerus is the king, etc., and Haman wants to kill all the Jews. But we know that Mordechai was one of the sages of the Sanhedrin, one of the leaders of the Jewish people who served in the Sanhedrin at the end of the first temple period. And then during the Babylonian exile, he was taken away. Became an important, prominent person over there in Shushan, right, which was the capital of the Persian Empire. Excuse me. So Petahya is Mordechai from the Book of Esther. And why was his name called Petahya, which resembles the word for opening, Petach, or in Ashkenaz pronunciation, Pesach. So we say Pesicha is the person who's given the honor of opening the ark on Saturday mornings or on festivals when the Torah is taken out. That's Pesicha, or you could pronounce it Peticha. And it means opening, right? Opening the ark. So why is his name Petahya or Pesachya? Why is Mordechai called the one who opens, as it were? And the reason is he would open, in other words, elucidate difficult topics and interpret them to the people, and because he knew all 70 languages that were known at the time. And recall that that's part of the Purim story in the Book of Esther, that Mordechai overhears two conspirators plotting to kill King Ahasuerus. And why did nobody else overhear them? Why is it that he knew what they were up to? It's because they were speaking in a foreign language that no one could understand, but he could, because he was one of the members of the Sanhedrin who spoke all the 70 languages of the world. The Mishnah resumes the list of officials. Excuse me. Ben-Achiyah was responsible for the care of the priests who suffered from intestinal disease. Nechunya was the well digger for pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem for the festivals. You know what, Nina, if you're actually listening right now, sometimes she has to step away, but if you are, please bring me a glass of water. I really need one. Thanks. So Nechunya was the well digger for pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem for the festivals. Gavini was the temple crier who would awaken the priests and the Levites for their temple duties. Ben Gever was responsible for locking the temple gates in the evening and for unlocking them in the morning. Ben Bevai was appointed over the shreds of the garments. This is such a beautiful thing. So the priests had very specific clothing, the garments of the priests that they had to wear. It is specified in the Torah what a Kohen, what a priest serving in the temple must wear. There's 4 specific garments, and exactly what material they're made out of is specified in the Torah. The Kohen Gadol, the high priest, wears those same 4 garments plus an additional 4 garments that are a part of the office of being the high priest. Over time, these priestly garments would wear out. Now, they're invested with a high level of sanctity. Right? I mean, the clothes that a priest wears when he's bringing offerings on behalf of the pilgrims who are bringing offerings in the temple are invested with a high degree of sanctity. Oh, thank you so much, honey. I appreciate it. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol nehi b'divrah. So when those clothes would wear out, you can't just toss them in the dumpster out back behind the temple. What would they do with it? They would actually take those clothes and shred them carefully, and then they would turn them, these pieces torn from the worn-out priestly garments, into the wicks of the menorah, the wicks of the candelabrum, the famous 7-branch candelabrum that was always lit, the light that was always burning in the temple. The wicks of those oil lamps were made from shreds of the priestly garments. Ben Arza was responsible for the symbol, not S-Y-M-B-O-L, but symbol C-Y-M-B-A-L, like plang, right? Like the cymbal player in the orchestra. So there was a symbol it was his job to beat it at the times that were necessary. Meaning the symbol which was rung as a signal that the Levites should commence their song, and Hugras ben Levi was responsible for the song. Right, so the priests served in the temple; they were responsible for everything having to do with the offerings. The Levites, I'm a Levite, right? We were sort of the servants of the priests, doing whatever they needed done, including the Levites formed the choir, right? So unlike me, Levites who could sing, there was a choir of them, and when you would go, if you went to the temple when it was standing in Jerusalem, first of all, you would smell it from a great distance, because the incense that was always burning was beautiful, beautiful smell. And as you approached, you would hear music. There was music always playing. The Levites were singing. They were singing psalms and other songs. They were playing instruments, harps and trumpets and drums and other kinds of instruments. And there was always music in the temple. It's a very beautiful experience. And the house of Garmu was responsible for the preparation of the showbread. So this is the lechem panim. These breads, these special 12 loaves of bread. Unleavened bread, but large. So imagine it was almost like a lasagna type of shape, like a large unleavened bread that was then folded over on the ends, and there were 12 of them, and they were stacked up in 2 piles of 6 on the special table in the courtyard of the temple. And it was the house of Garmu who was responsible for baking those. And it was the house of Aftinas. In other words, this was a family, the Garmu family for the bread, and Aftinas family for the preparation of the incense. And Elazar was responsible for weaving the temple curtains that would need maintenance from time to time. And Pinkus was the valet, who assisted the priests in fitting their clothes and dressing themselves for their temple service. So the priests would come and go, a new shift of priests every week. But these officials were always there, and they kept things running smoothly and sort of showing the priests what to do and where to start and make sure they're dressed properly, etc. That's the Mishnah, this first Mishnah of chapter 5. Now we get into the Gemara. So the Mishnah lists 15 names of officials who filled specific positions in the temple, despite the fact that during the many years of the temple, there must have been far more than 15 officials who served in those functions. Rabbi Chizkiah said that Rabbi Simon and the rabbis disagreed as to why the Mishnah mentioned only these 15 names. One of them said the Mishnah comes to enumerate those who were the most fit of all the officials who served in each position, from whatever generation they were from. And the other said, well, the Tana, the rabbi of the Mishnah, who was in that generation, enumerated those officials who served in his generation. That's 2 opinions of who they were. I've listed some other opinions of why these particular people were listed, and these that are mentioned here are not the only 2 opinions. Several of these officials are also mentioned in the Mishnah in Tractate Yoma, which is the next Mishnah, the next tractate that we're going to be covering when we finish Shekalim. It's only 22 pages. Here we are on page 13, not that long to go. And I'm aware that we're 3 days behind. We'll get caught up, but I didn't want to do a double page today because these are so interesting. So anyway, our next tractate is Yoma, and in Yoma, there is a dispute about these priests who were named, and some of them for praise on page 37a, and others for censure, for criticism on page 38a. And the Gemara notes that this issue is related to the aforementioned dispute between Rabbi Simon and the rabbis. The one who said that the Mishnah comes to enumerate these specific individuals who held these jobs, enumerated them because they are the most fit of those who served from all the generations of people who served in those positions, claims that when the Mishnah in Tractate Yoma says, quoting Proverbs 10:7, the memory of a righteous person shall be for a blessing, it is in reference to all of them. These people were so righteous in how they conducted themselves in their jobs in the temple, that they were remembered as the best examples of who did those jobs. Conversely, the one who said that the Tana, who was in that generation, enumerated those officials who served in his own generation, not because they were the best examples of all the generations, would go to that Mishnah and Tractate Yoma, citing Proverbs 10:7, continuation, but the name of the wicked shall rot, in reference to all of them. And with regard to whom is the Tana in Yoma, Tractate Yoma, speaking when he sets the verse, what the memory of the righteous shall be for a blessing. So he is referring only to Ben Katin, who improved the basin for the priests in the temple and his colleagues. So this opinion is saying that actually all these names that I mentioned, they weren't the best at it. They actually were problematic. There was a problem. And of all of them, only one of them really is for a blessing, and the rest of them, are remembered as negatively, to criticize them. So what is the problem? What did they do that they should be remembered, critically? And I'll just read about that. It's very interesting. Hold on a second. I thought I saw a note about that. Okay. So why are they being criticized? So according to this opinion, the Tana in Tractate Yoma maintains that the reason these officials did not teach their specialties to others was because they wanted to prevent their knowledge from being used for idol worship. So that's when they're being praised, right? That they became extremely adept at doing their jobs, but they were very careful of who they would teach how they would train their replacement, as it were, because nobody should sort of acquire the knowledge of how to do things in the temple, so that then they could go somewhere else and do things in the same way in some temple of idolatry. So they were very careful who they shared this information with. But the officials who were criticized are those like Kamtsar, who refused to divulge their secrets for unworthy reasons, meaning some of them perhaps didn't share the secrets of their office simply because they were afraid that then somebody would replace them, and they were only worried about themselves. And that would be a very negative emotion, a very negative motivation in the eyes of the sages for why they would maintain the secrets of their office. After recording the praises of, and so then we mentioned a few who were praised, right? Like Ben Katin, who improved the vessels that were used in the temple while he served in that office. So now that we've praised some historical figures, so the Gemara is now going to start a digression on a similar vein of praising specific people in Jewish history. So Rabbi Yonah said that it is written, "Therefore will I divide him a portion among the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the mighty, because he bared his soul until death and was numbered with the transgressors." This is Isaiah 53:12. And this verse is referring to Rabbi Kiva, according to Rabbi Yonah. Why was Rabbi Kiva so great, and that this verse from Isaiah could be applied to him? Because Rabbi Kiva conveyed the oral law to the people. He was a great, great educator, right? Not just a Talmudist, but a Talmudist who shared the Talmud with the Jewish people. And he made it more accessible to them by arranging the laws and the homilies, the sort of ethical teachings, in a more organized way, i.e. the Mishna. Right? All of these teachings had been in place, like the sort of chain of transmission originated at Mount Sinai with certain teachings that God gave to Moses in an oral form rather than a written form. And then the interpretation of the laws and how to do things in certain ways in every generation, they added to it that oral tradition. When Rabbi Akiva came along, a long time after Moses, right? About 1,100 years after Moses, when Rabbi Kiva came along, there was this huge body of the oral law, and Rabbi Kiva was like one of the early people to really, dig in and organize it. And him and Rabbi Meir are really the principal people responsible for organizing the Mishnah. It would be Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi who published the Mishnah. He was responsible for the final form and editing and redacting it, but really was already called the Mishnah, had been organized into the Mishnah as such, primarily by Rabbi Akiva and his student, Rabbi Meir. And some say that the members of the Great Assembly arranged these compilations of Torah knowledge. But if so, what did this great sage, Rabbi Akiva, arrange? He arranged the interpretive method of generalizations and details. I mean, maybe he didn't arrange the whole Mishnah himself. It was part of a massive project that involved many people. But he certainly was very prominent among them. We skip down a few paragraphs. Rabbi Chagay said in the name of Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman, the former sages, i.e. the scholars of earlier generations, metaphorically speaking, they plowed and planted, weeded, cleared thorns, hoed, harvested, gathered sheaves into a pile, threshed the sheaves, winnowed the threshed grain, separated the bad grain from the good, ground the remainder of the good grain into flour, sifted the flour in a sieve, kneaded the dough, smoothed the surface of the unbaked loaves with liquid, and baked the bread. They prepared everything so that we should be able to grasp Torah concepts. And yet, after all that, we have nothing to eat. In other words, we are still unable to understand the Torah properly, despite all this work that the earlier generations did so that the oral law and the written law would be before us and be, digestible for us. Nevertheless, we're confused. We don't know how to eat the Torah properly. And so now we're going to... So now the Gemara cites, let me just continue. The Gemara cites another metaphor with regard to the relationship between the earlier and later generations. Rabbi Abba bar Zemina said in the name of Rabbi Zera, this is very famous, if the former generations were akin to angels, we are akin to humans. And if they were akin to humans, we are akin to donkeys. Rabbi Mana said, at that hour, when the previous statement was issued, they also said, we are not even comparable to the female donkey, meaning the donkey, but in Hebrew, just like in Spanish, there's male and female versions that's included in the word, so that's why we have two words, female donkey. We're not even comparable to the female donkey of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair. So before I tell this story about Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, this is a common trope in the Talmud. It's important for us to understand it. And it's summed up in this joke, which I'm sure I've shared before, that there's two grandfathers, right, who end up sitting next to each other on a plane. And, right, one is just, secular, not involved in a life of faith at all. And the other one is a guy with a long beard, and let's say he's a religious Jew. But he can almost be, other religions as well. In this case, the way we're telling the story is he's a religious Jew. He's a from Yid, right? And they're both traveling with their grandsons, right? So the religious man's grandson is attending to his grandfather very carefully. Grandfather, can I get you a drink? Would you like something from the front? Should I ask for you? Are you comfortable? Do you need a blanket? And he's really taking care of his grandfather. And the other one, his grandson, is, just very rambunctious and constantly getting in trouble. And when the grandfather tries to, please, my son, sit down, take it easy, he's very rude to his grandfather and says, no, I don't want to. Leave me alone. Who do you think you are? You're not my dad, etc. And after a while of this, the grandfather with the rude grandchild, speaks to the one with the very doting, caring grandchild and says, it's amazing how your grandson is so respectful of his elders. I wish my grandson would be that way. And the other guy says to him, well, I'll tell you something. You taught your grandson that his ancestors are apes. Right? So every generation getting away from the apes means that he's more sophisticated, more evolved, more important than you are, because you're 2 generations closer to the apes. But we teach our kids, that the greatest, infusion of wisdom that ever came into the world came directly from God at Mount Sinai. And every generation since is a little bit further removed from that great source of wisdom that came into the world when the Torah was given. So he respects me as somebody who's a little bit closer to the seat of wisdom, and that's why he wants to learn from me. Now, I'm not here to, this is not a debate about evolution or not at all. That's not what this is about. But as a Talmudic trope, that comes all the time, even among the sages themselves. No matter how great they were, they had enormous respect for their elders because their teachers were one generation closer to when the Torah was given. And so the sages say no matter how much we organize ourselves, no matter how much we study, no matter what tools come into our belt, as it were, and eventually, computers and computerized analysis and scholarly this and that, we're always a little bit further removed from the source of this wisdom, and we can't know it as well as the generation before us, who couldn't know it as well as the generation before them. Of course, knowledge gets added in every generation because new situations come up where these old principles and old wisdom gets applied. So there's tremendous amounts of new wisdom and knowledge enter with every generation. That's why the Talmud now, the Art Scroll, 73 volumes. Nevertheless, tremendous respect for the earlier generations. And that's what we're hearing here. If they were angels, we're like humans. If they're like humans, we're like donkeys. And at the same time, it was said, and we, meaning the Tanaim who are speaking here, right? The sages of the Mishnah, that we look back at them, even the Amoraim of the Talmud thought that the sages of the Mishnah were so much higher than them. Here they're saying that the sages of the Mishnah viewed themselves as not even as wise as the donkey of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair. Now, how could a donkey be wise? Okay. The sages who came before me, I get, they're so wise. They're closer. They studied with great sages themselves. But a donkey? How could a donkey be wise? And the Gemara explains the reference to this particular donkey. This is a unique donkey. The donkey of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair was stolen by robbers one night, and it was kept hidden by them for 3 days. And yet, it did not eat anything. After 3 days, they reconsidered and decided to return it. They said to themselves, let's get it out of here so that it shouldn't die in our possession and leave a stench in our cave. When they set it free, it went and walked back to its master's house, to Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair's house, and it stood by its master's gate, and it began braying for its master. Rabbi Pinchas said to the members of his household, open up the door for that poor creature which has gone 3 days without eating anything. How did he know that it hadn't eaten? They opened the gate for it, and it entered Rabbi Pinchas's courtyard. He told them, give the donkey something to eat. They placed barley before the donkey, but it would not eat. They said to him, Rabbi, it will not eat. He said to them, has the barley been tithed so that it is fit to eat? This is what's so special about Rabbi Pinchas's donkey. It would know somehow whether the barley that it was being offered had been tithed, right? When you harvest grain in ancient Israel, when the temple is standing, right, every farmer who harvests grain has to set aside the tithes. The first 2% for the priest, the next 10% for the Levite, and the next 10% either for the poor, the widow and the orphan, or for himself when he's making a pilgrimage up to Jerusalem. All the tithes have to be taken out. And until then, a person cannot use that grain for any purpose whatsoever. So he says to them, this barley that you placed before it, has it been tithed? Well, they said to him, yes, it has been tithed. And he then asked them, and have you separated their doubtfully tithed produce? This is called demai. This is when you buy produce from an Am Haaretz, a Jew who may not be educated in Torah and who may not have tithed properly. We're not sure whether he tithed his grain properly. In that case, a pious person is obligated to tithe again. Right? Or to tithe it just to make sure that it's been tithed, even though it might result in that grain being tithed twice. They replied to Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, didn't you teach us the following, Rabbi? One who purchases grain for the purpose not of eating it themselves, but of feeding an animal, or flour for processing animal hides, or oil for lighting a lamp. In all these cases, as opposed to us eating it, humans eating it, in these cases, even demai is exempt from doing another tithing just to make sure that it's been tithed. We don't have to tithe demai, this doubtfully tithed produce, if we're not going to use it for human consumption. And he said to them, well, what can we do for this poor creature, which is so very strict with itself and will not eat even from doubtfully tithed produce, despite this exemption, and clearly, even though it hadn't eaten for 3 days. And they therefore separated tithes from this demai, this doubtfully tithed produce, and the donkey finally ate the barley grains. I didn't write it. I recount the story for you as it's listed here in Shekalim Yud Gimel. The donkey of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair was so accustomed to being there and hearing the lectures of the rabbi. Maybe it was another incarnation of an earlier sage. Who can know? Who can understand? But this donkey instinctively knew whether produce had been tithed or not. Its wisdom was that great. The Mishna returning to the Mishnah states that Petahya, who was responsible for the pairs of birds, come and see how great was the skill of that man. He could open, that's why his name is Petahya, he could open difficult topics and interpret them. As mentioned in the Mishnah, he understood all 70 languages. And the Gemara adds, it was taught in a baraisa, a Sanhedrin, sort of that executive rabbinical council when the temple was standing. This was the high court of the land, and made of the most prominent sages in Jerusalem. A Sanhedrin that includes 2 members who are able to speak all the 70 languages of the world, and all its members are at least able to understand those languages, even though they don't speak them. This court is minimally fit to serve as a Sanhedrin. If the Sanhedrin has 3 members who speak all those languages, it is considered a medium-level Sanhedrin. And if it has 4 who speak all the 70 languages of the world, it is a wise Sanhedrin. In Yavne was where they moved the Sanhedrin after the Second Temple was destroyed. In Yavne, the Sanhedrin included 4 who could speak all 70 languages. And they were Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Ben Chakinai, and Rabbi Lazar ben Matya. Ben Azai and Ben Zoma we've encountered a bunch of times. They, along with Rabbi Kiva and Elisha ben Abuya, are the 4 who entered Pardes. Kiva, in other words, had a mystical experience. Kiva went in peace and returned in peace. Elisha ben Abuya something went wrong with him, and he came out and became evil, and then was known as Acher, the other one. Ben Azai, I think, and then I can't remember which is which. One of these guys lost his mind. He kind of went crazy, and the other one died. Ben Azai and Ben Zoma. One went crazy and one died. The Gemara cites a story that exemplifies Petahya's skills at understanding linguistic allusions. Rabbi Chisda said, once Eretz Yisrael dried up, and there was a drought. No grain grew there, and the sages did not know from where they could bring the omer, and the measure of barley brought as a communal offering on the 16th of Nisan. And there was a mute present who knew where there was some barley growing that year. But he couldn't speak, right? And I guess he hadn't learned how to write so that he could write it out for them. So he was just they didn't have sign language then. So he was just kind of making gestures, trying to communicate to them where they could find some barley. I guess it didn't make sense at that moment to say, well, follow me all the way to this other town that's several days' journey. And he placed one of his hands on indicating the roofs of the buildings nearby, and another hand indicating huts, alluding to the name of the place where barley could be found. Since they did not understand his allusions, they brought Petahya, who we said earlier is Mordechai from the Book of Esther, who observed the actions of the mute and said to them, is there a place called Gagot Tserifin, or Tserifin Gagot, roofs and huts, or huts and roofs? And they remembered that there was indeed such a place, and they went there and found barley for the omer. I'm sorry I didn't give you a warning. That's as much as we're going to do today. So let's think about, what is our takeaway from today. There are a few different opinions, before I get to the comments and questions, there are a few different opinions given about why those specific officials were listed as exemplars of their office in the temple. And learning about them gives us a little bit of a feeling for how things were run in the temple. The guy in charge of the seals, where you would go, pay for the wine at the treasury and then go receive the wine elsewhere. The guy who's in charge of, shredding the worn out priest costumes, garments of the priests, and turning them into the wicks in the candelabra, etc. And imagine, if you would, that, thousands of years from now, and I mean, now there's just so much, so much record keeping of what our time was like. There'd be film and video and just so much. But I don't know, imagine there was some kind of like electromagnetic pulse and all the digital records, were destroyed, and God forbid some kind of apocalyptic war. And so many of the records were lost, right? But there was a book that was found about, describing various things that are done in our world, right? And I think in America, I don't know, something like 1 million lawyers. Who would be the lawyer? That would be listed there as an example of what a lawyer is and what a lawyer does. Who would be the doctor, and who would be the banker, the accountant, maybe the computer programmer, and who knows who would end up getting that kind of honor. But I love the idea, that we should ask ourselves what kind of a legacy we're leaving, right? Not just how good we are to our families or how good we are in giving to charity, but also how we conduct ourselves in our professions, and ask ourselves, how far are we from being an example, an exemplar of how whatever profession we're involved in, should be done. And like I said, the only one in a generation could be named, so the rest of us won't be. But nevertheless, isn't it something to aspire to, right? That we would think, maybe, if I just did a little better, if I could come a little bit closer to that kind of an ideal level, it would be better. It doesn't matter that I won't make it, but if I could be a little better at what I do, imagine if, I somehow ended up serving as the example of how to do this job when they looked up the records, 2,000 years from now. All right, let's check out your comments and questions. Tom, were these officials Levium? Great question. So I'm not sure. It doesn't say that, so maybe when we get to Tractate Yoma, that'll become clearer. I don't think they're Kohanim. And we know that, in terms of like who else is serving in the temple, that it's the Levium. Now, but some of the Levium are named as the ones in charge of the music, the symbol that starts and ends the music, and the music itself. Those for sure are Levites. So are these other officials necessarily Levites? I'm not sure. So we don't know yet. It's certainly a good guess. It makes sense, but I can't answer affirmatively yes or no. And I didn't see a note about that. I was looking for it. But it just doesn't say anything about them being Levites. And then regarding the two that are specifically Levites, I don't see a note about that. So it's a great question, and hopefully we'll learn more as we go along and whether that's true or not. Bill, I am put in mind of a teaching from my own tradition. I planted, so-and-so watered, but God gave the growth. We may indeed strive to learn the teachings of past generations, but ultimately rely on the goodness of God to illuminate those teachings in a way to understand them truly. Absolutely. And, of course, the sages are much given to hyperbole. So they're not really going to view themselves as donkeys compared to the ones before. But the idea that we should honor our elders like we just don't know, right? What's that other saying? Well, I've taught you everything you know, but I haven't taught you everything I know. Now, the best teachers try to transmit everything that they know, But they can't, right? There's no way to transmit everything that they know. So much that they know is gathered by experience. It's instinctive. And it came, right, because they stood on the shoulders of the previous generation. And something is always lost in that chain of transmission. And, this is a society that we live in that really worships youth sometimes way too much. We should respect new voices. We should respect youth, absolutely. But, we should really give props to our elders in a way that sometimes our culture doesn't. Rochelle, but weren't we all at Sinai? Yes, we were all at Sinai. Our souls were there. But then, we don't bring all those memories with us, right? Do you remember being at Sinai? Now, I think what our faith says is that every lifetime that we lead, Judaism definitely believes in reincarnation for various reasons. It's not clear how many incarnations, when you go, when you need to come back. None of this is laid out with no debate. There's a lot of debate about that. But one idea that permeates all of that discussion is that, what can we bring with us to the next world? We can bring our merits, meaning we can bring the fact that we did good deeds while we were in this world, and that will accrue to our merit and be weighed against all of our misdeeds and sort of assigning us our place in the world to come. But what can we really bring with us? What we learned, right? So what we learned, the wisdom we acquired, the Torah we learned and taught, that we can bring with us to the next world where the learning goes on. Right? And if we live a few lifetimes, well, we can bring the learning of the multiple lifetimes to that world. But we don't have access to the learning of previous lifetimes while we're here in this world. There we have to strive as much as we can, while starting over every time. David, were there any non-Israelites at Sinai? So for sure, there was a lot of Egyptians who joined the Jewish people. Right? They're called the mixed multitude, who joined the Jewish people. And for all I know, they weren't only Egyptians. Maybe there were people, who heard what was going on in Egypt, because the 10 plagues took about a year to play out. And it was clear that, at least to some people, that God was involved, was taking care of his children, the children of Israel. And so when they came out of Egypt, a lot of other people went with the children of Israel, but they were people who joined the children of Israel. Some maybe less wholeheartedly than others, and that's why the sages teach that a lot more of those kind of people were involved in the sin of the golden calf. But certainly not like it was only the non-Israelites. No, there were many Jews involved in the sin of the golden calf. We're all responsible for it. And a lot of the people who were the sort of foremost, agitators in that sin, the sin of the golden calf, were killed that day by Moses and the Levites who assisted him. But it wasn't like there were sort of other nations coming in from the neighboring nations to be there. We don't have a tradition that says that. However, we do have a tradition that says when the Torah was given in Mount Sinai, even though the other nations weren't there present with the children of Israel receiving the Torah, they were aware throughout the world that something had happened. Something was happening in the world. It was like literally the whole earth shook with it. And not in the nature of just an earthquake. We had an earthquake here in LA last night, a 4.0, right in the middle of LA. I was awake for it at 4 a.m. Earthquakes definitely get your attention, but it was more than an earthquake. I don't know how much people knew who weren't there present what was going on at Sinai, but they knew something was going on. And final question. Sharon, how does that square with the stress placed in the Torah on humility? How does what square? Because the idea of saying that the earlier generations knew much more than we do, that squares with the concept of humility. So I'm not sure what your question is on that, but maybe put it in tomorrow so that I can address it better tomorrow. Okay, that's all we have time for. Sending you all a big hug, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow. This chapter 5 is really an interesting one, and I'm sure